And I swear to God, this happened I swear to God, I'm an atheist, but whatever, you get the point.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. Come with us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I identify as a cisgender woman, and my pronouns are she and her. In this episode, I have a conversation with Cassie Brighter, a writer and public speaker focusing on intersectionality and social justice. She is the founder of Empowered Trans Women and Smart Sluts, a sex-positive community of women. Cassie's pronouns are she and her, and she is a Latina woman of trans experience. Find out what that means to Cassie in this episode. We also talk about the subtleties and challenges of inclusive language, internalized transphobia, being the best of both worlds, toxic masculinity as a cult, sex positivity and freeing ourselves from shame, female anatomy, consent, and leaving a legacy. Please be aware that there is mention of suicide, death, and rape in this episode. To clarify some terminology that is used in the episode, TERF is an abbreviation of Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist. It was recorded on the 12th of January 2021. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Hi, Esther. My name is Cassie Brighter, and I'm in Portland, Oregon.
Hello, Cassie, and welcome. And how do you identify?
I would say that I identify as a writer.
Yeah.
But I think that what you're asking me is about gender. I'm a woman of trans experience.
See, I love that of trans experience.
I'll tell you what the etymology of that. One of the ways that emerges, and we spoke about it in an earlier conversation, there is an undercurrent of challenge and attack that happens to trans women that the average mainstream person is not aware of, the average cis woman is not aware of. We are constantly pursued and challenged and attacked, and very much like yapping dogs. The one demographic that comes after us is TERFs, which are they used to define themselves as trans exclusionary radical feminists. They now object to the term which they came up with themselves, but they're exclusionists. And then there's men who make it their mission to explain to us that we're not women. And these two demographics are small, I would say, in terms of population, but they're very intense and very invested in ruining our day and affecting us negatively. And so one of those nuances that emerges after that is the word trans woman is written separately, in the same way that the word tall woman or blonde woman is written separately. Left-handed woman is written separately. Trans woman is written separately. And the reason for that is because there was at one point a big effort on behalf of the exclusionist women in England, which are frankly the worst, to make it a very good point that trans women is a designation that's other from and different from woman, and then that they were specifically writing it as one word altogether. They've taken it farther now. They now call us TIM. I don't know if you've heard that term.
TIM? No.
Yeah, they refer to us as TIM, which stands for trans identifying male.
Good grief. That doesn't... Oh, God. Oh, it's really
So
not...
at any rate, there's all these nuances that we trans women add to vocabulary that might seem like affectations. They might seem like, well, they're just being silly. But each one of these is driven by some particular attack on our identity. Much in the same way that when you see a hair dryer and there's a label that says, do not use this in the shower. And you think to yourself, well, why would you have to say that? Well, it's because someone did it.
Right? Yeah. Oh, goodness me. Yeah. So actually, one of the things I've been thinking about recently is like it's very subtle in wording, isn't it? So there's gender diverse folks who say, I am trans, or people say, I identify as trans. So that the I am versus I identify as. And as you noticed at the start of the podcast, that's kind of how I start with, speaking to people, having conversations is how do you identify? So Do you see that as a problematic term or a question?
Um, Gosh, we could spend a whole podcast just talking about these topics, but we won't because there's more interesting things to talk about. But I will make a quick note on that. So, first of all, problematic is a really big range of
Hmm.
topics. I think each one of us is imperfect and each one of us is problematic in some way. And, you have people that are problematic in the sense of Russell Brand is problematic in a couple of ways. I would still sleep with him, though. Um, And then you have somebody like Piers Morgan, and he's problematic in a whole different range of ways.
Fair. Hmm.
So most things in the 21st century are problematic, and we're going to look back on. Well, we won't be around, but people are going to look back in the 24th century, and they're going to think us cave people because of
Yeah.
how did we not see this before?
Yeah.
But so yeah, a lot of things are problematic, and that should not be a denouncement. That should be oh, so we could tweak this, we could improve it. How do you identify is good because it acknowledges the gender spectrum, and it opens the conversation. It allows the person to express what gender they are. But some trans people object to it on the sense that there's been attacks to identity that, like, one example is I identify as an attack helicopter is a common joke. I have actually been sent images of attack helicopters without any text, just the attack helicopter. And to which I say, by the way, if you identify as an attack helicopter, by all means, let's respect your gender and let's fill you up with high combustive gasoline, petrol. Let's fill you up with petrol and let's toss you from a building because you identify as a helicopter. I'm fully for it. But um,
Oh, yeah.
so identify is just it's open to interpretation and stuff like that. Generally speaking, this is what I would like to have folks consider. Whatever food you serve yourself, serve me the same food, hand me the same bread. Do not have a special bread from the back of the store for me.
Mm,
So if you yourself would say to a group of strangers, I identify as a woman, then I'm very happy to go to that same group and present myself as I identify as a woman. But if I see that you say I am a woman, then I don't see why I should make a distinction and use the word identify. I also am a woman.
mhm,
So anyway, that's my soapbox
mm.
argument on that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, really. It's such a delicate thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I'm hypersensitive to these things because I'm a trans activist
Of course.
and I'm an intersectional feminist and I'm a writer. So I'm constantly nitpicking at these things, and any of these we can dwell on as we've chosen to pause for a second on this one, or we can just shrug off and say, well, that's fine, and let's move on. And
Mm,
I personally really don't like when somebody describes a woman as a female, as a
mm.
noun, female as
Yeah.
a noun. I personally think that it's insulting to women
Mhm,
because a female rat is also a female. The female slug is also a female. So I
mhm,
really like to say a woman, and it's not a trans issue. It's just an issue of granting women our humanhood, our
mhm.
not to dehumanize us. But if a girl says, "Oh, I'm a female," I'm not going to correct her. It's her choice to use the words she wants to use. So,
Yeah, that's
and
fair.
by the way, all
Yeah.
trans women have different ways to designate themselves. So that's another nuance that I want to mention is we're colored by our bringing, by our context, by our cultural context. We may use words which are not used in other parts of the world. In Argentina, the term for transgender is travesti
Mm,
in Spanish, which is a mispronunciation of French and English transvestite, which
mhm,
is a horrible language word. It's a horrible word to use,
mm,
but they just haven't explored their own language to come up with something
mm.
better. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's cultural. But anyway, enough said about language.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you about one more thing. If someone were to run an event, for example, and they want to be inclusive, what would be the best way to put it? Because you see terms like this event is open to women and all those who identify as women. What would you say? What would you not say? What is correct and what is not correct in your book?
So first of all, I'm going to say that I have compassion for people who have confronted this issue, this
Mm-hmm.
problem, because I've struggled as an event organizer myself. I've struggled with this, and I've
Mm.
defaulted to just saying women, and then trans women and non-binary folk and trans feminine people have written to me asking, well, am I included in that? And
Mm.
so I see the need to make a distinction. And so here's one fundamental way to just shorthand it. If you say women and you use a Y instead of an E, women
Mm-hmm.
spelled with a Y at the end. That was originally a feminist statement to take away the word men from women,
Mm. Right.
but it has been entirely appropriated by TERFs. And so when they say women with a Y, they mean to say, and no trans women need apply. So
Mm.
we know that by the virtue of the spelling. There is a spelling of women with an X,
Mm-hmm.
WOMXN, and that's a signal that it's women used in the larger sense of the word, in the more inclusive sense of the word.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen women plus. Women
Mm-hmm.
plus means that we include all women and we also include non binary folk. And
Mm-hmm.
that's, by the way, a really important distinction to make because quite often people think they're being inclusive by saying all women are welcome. And by the way, non binary people are, of course, welcome too. And that's an effort to be inclusive, but it's actually a big fuck you to non binary people who are not women. So you're actually dismissing their gender by stating it that way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
women plus I like. Women plus means all kinds of women, and also we include non-binary people. We include trans feminine people. We include people who are on the feminine spectrum but do not call themselves women. It is a
Mm-hmm.
challenge,
Yeah.
but this is something that I would really like to stress. If you write for an event, this event is open to all those who identify as women. Then I will go. If you write in the event, this is available to women and all those who identify as women, then my reaction is fuck you on the horse you rode in on, and I'm not going to go. Because
Yeah.
what you just said is we welcome women and we welcome those who, in their fanciful minds, consider themselves female, even though we all know that they're not. That's what you've
Mm.
said. That's what you've implied. And I'm being unkind, I realize that, but I'm just trying to be caustic for the
It's a
sake
good
of making
point,
the
though.
point.
Yeah. Yeah. No, totally. Actually, sort of to talk a bit more about your own journey, when did you come out as trans?
It's a layered thing. I wrote a letter to my parents, a manifesto to my parents, not fully coming out, so to speak, but foreshadowing by saying that their understanding of my gender and their understanding of my sexuality is not correct, and that I've been trying to appease and trying to please for all these years, but now I am diving into a deeper journey of myself and my gender, my sexuality, and there will be changes. And that
Mm.
was in the heels of my brother's passing, which was a major catalyst in my coming out journey. My brother passed away in his 40s. He was a major reference point in my life, and it propelled me into a very urgent self discovery journey. But
Mm.
anyway, so I wrote that letter in 2000, late 2009, early 2010. I confessed being trans to my roommate in 2010. I started very tentatively wearing women's clothing in 2010, 2011, terrified, ashamed, embarrassed. My sister asked me in 2011 if I was going to go to Pride, and I laughed. I said, I'm not anywhere near close to Pride. I'm at self abasement and shame and
Mm.
and self consciousness and humiliation right now. I'll work myself up to Pride.
Mm.
But anyway, so 2010 was beginning my journey. But when people ask me, and then 2014, most of my friends knew, my family knew. 2016, I got on hormones.
Mm-hmm.
2017, I came out at work, which did not go well. So it was a several multi-stage kind of a process. But when people ask me, when did you first know
Mm-hmm.
that you're a trans woman? Then that
Yeah.
answer
That would have
is
been my next question.
amusing. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
I find my answer to that always amuses me to no end because my answer is at 44 and at 37. and at 32 and at 27 and at 25 and at 23 and at 19 and at 17 and at 11 and at 9 and at 8. And
Mm-hmm.
every single time a major shock to my system, every single time a complete revelation, every single time oh my god.
Mm.
Because the ability that I have had all my life to put this away, to tuck it away in some part of my attic and to say, no, no, we're not going to look at this, is just bewildering. The ability to disassociate and compartmentalize and not look at something that was so obvious all of my life. But I
Mm.
just didn't want to see it. I ran into the first trans women that I ever saw in real life was in 1985. I was in Times Square in New York, having recently immigrated from Argentina,
Mm-hmm.
and I found Times Square shocking and fascinating and scary, and it was full of peep shows and it was full of adult entertainment, and it was chaotic at the time. And there was a loud group of sex worker trans women in the corner, and they were very loud and very garishly dressed, and they scared the life out of me. And the thought I had in my head is, oh God, please God, let me not be one of those.
Mm.
Which I want to quote Hannah Gadsby. I loved her show Nanette.
Mm-hmm.
She
Yeah.
had a line in that show that really, really resonated. She made me break down in sobs. She said, "So by the time I realized I was a lesbian, it was already too late because I was already a homophobe."
Mm. Yeah.
And that was definitely the case for me. By the time I could even acknowledge that I was bisexual, I was already a homophobe. And then to have to acknowledge that you're transgender when you very much a transphobe.
Mm.
And I don't mean, okay, so again, we get caught up in language. Transphobia generally manifests as hatred in society. So there really should be a different term for that because it's hatred, it's not fear. In my case, it was very much fear. It
Mm.
was fear of being one of these. It was fear of understanding the fact that there's this pariah element in society, this completely discriminated, untouchables element of society, and the deep suspicion that that's where I belonged, that I was one of those.
Mm.
Um, Usually, when when you think to yourself, "Am I one of those?" If you ask yourself the question, "Am I a lesbian?" Yes. If you ask them that question, then strong chances are.
Yeah. Yeah. What made you come out when you did? I mean, did you do the when you were trying to, well, not be trans, I suppose, did you do the conventional thing, I suppose, have a family and get married and things like that?
Yeah, I was married twice. I married once when I was 19. I married a divorcee with a 5-year-old kid, instant family.
Ah, yeah.
Because I was just desperate to form a family. I was never quite happy with my family nucleus, and I wanted to escape that, but I wanted to have a family. And then also I was very aware of the fact that I was oh, so this is something I want to touch on next, by the way. But I was very aware of the fact that I was broken, I was defective in some way. And
Mm.
so it was very important to me to try to meet this need to make a family as quickly as possible. It was a main driver for me. So when this opportunity presented itself with this woman in my life who I don't know to what extent we were romantically involved. We were partners in crime in the sense that we were both trying to survive. We were flailing in terms of our life path, and we found each other. We found one another. We became fast friends, and we were also sexual with each other.
Mhm.
And we decided to get married, and then soon after we had a child. So that was my first marriage,
Mhm.
and but it wasn't conventional in many ways. And
Mhm.
then I spent many years hiding from myself, and then because AIDS, because also this is something really important to mention, because I'm probably going to be perceived as a coward, and I was very cowardly, but at the same time, the moment I realized that I like men, the moment 17 years old, I realized that I like men, I realized that I like to be sexually penetrated, I realized that I like penises.
Mm.
That same month, Rock Hudson died publicly of AIDS on national TV. So my coming out, not my coming out, my blossoming sexually was waking up to the AIDS epidemic. And I was in the epicenter of the world of the AIDS epidemic because I was in New York City. And
Mm.
men were dropping like flies around me. And so I fled New York and I fled life in general, and he spent the next over a decade in a cult, being completely asexual. I didn't even masturbate.
Well.
Um, and I
Mm.
emerged from that in my late 20s, and my plan in my late 20s was to sleep with a whole bunch of people and find myself and discover what I like.
Make up for lost time. Right.
Yeah, I was really planning this. And instead, what happened is I met one woman. I fell madly in love because I had been so desperate for love for a long, long time.
Mm.
And she was in her late 20s, and she very much had an agenda. And so 6 months later, we're engaged. 6 months after that, we're married. And a year after that, we had our first child. And the next 10 years was spent in this Ken and Barbie fantasy where
Mm.
we had all these agreements. We had also agreements about how often a year I can shave my legs. We had these agreements about she's going to keep her hair long and feminine as long as I keep my hair short and masculine. We had all of these guardrails and agreements, which I don't think are part of a normal heterosexual marriage.
Sounds unconventional. Yeah.
She every now and then she would humor me by switching roles with me in the bedroom, and it was always a treat. And we thought we were pulling it off. She was aware of the fact that I was feminine. She was aware of the fact that I was bisexual since our first date, because I really believe in disclosure. And we thought we were pulling it off, but there were all these ways in which it wasn't working and in which it was toxic to to both of us. I would micromanage her gender expression.
Yeah.
I would criticize her nails, and I would tell her which how high heels she should wear on this occasion.
Mhm.
Which is extremely toxic looking back, but I was living through her. I was living vicariously through her. I couldn't express my gender. So I'm sure that I caused pain to her, and she caused a lot of pain for me because she kept me deep in the closet. I wasn't allowed to disclose anything about my sexuality or my identity to anyone. It was a deeply held secret, and anything secretive implies shame. You asked me what propelled my coming out. Well,
Mhm.
we divorced in 2007. I slept with a whole bunch of men in 2009, and I did not find it enjoyable, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought that maybe this would change things. It didn't. Uh,
Mm.
several men, several men at the time rejected me because they said I was too feminine.
Right.
And then my brother died tragically in a bicycle accident. He raced bicycles. Completely unexpected. The man was extremely healthy. Did yoga 3 hours a day. Was going to outlive us all.
Mm.
And that was a big shock, and I found myself experiencing these weird emotions. Of course, the grief, the loss, but also I resented him. I was mad at him. And when I looked
Right.
into that, he had taken death off the table. He had taken the death card off the table, and it had always been my out, my escape valve.
Mm.
I had suicidal ideation since I was a young teen, and now that one sibling is dead, of course it wouldn't be proper for the other sibling to off themselves, which really kind of elevated in my thoughts. Like, well, how seriously are you thinking of this? Also, at the time, I had been doing, which is also another indicator. I was doing research into the transgender experience, which is just collecting trivia.
Yeah.
Um, but I had come into the statistic, which is over 42% of trans women attempt to commit suicide.
Mm.
So I started thinking about this feeling of the death card of the table and whatnot. I was thinking, well, you're not thinking about this, are you? And I'm like, well, no, of course not. I'm a sensible person. I'm a survivalist. No, survivalist is it means something else. I mean, I'm survival minded. Survivor is what I'm trying to say. I have two young children. I had two growing children. I couldn't possibly. But then again, I know exactly how I would do it.
Mhm.
I know I at the time I had life insurance worth $400,000. I knew how it would distribute among my children. I
Mm.
knew exactly that there was 7 months and a couple of weeks until the suicide clause in the insurance plan expired. These are just random trivia I kept in my head.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah.
When this hit me in the face, I realized, wait a minute, you're actually at risk. And you can't afford to be at risk because you need to be around for your children for at least another 10 years.
Mm.
And so reluctantly, begrudgingly, I decided that I needed to transition because otherwise I was constantly at risk of suicide. And I knew it was going to be a shit show, and I knew this wasn't going to be a bed of roses. I fully expected to end up under a bridge with people spitting at me, which in some ways, I think my experience is better than that. So starting with really low expectations is a good plan.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah, well, one thing that I would like to say is there's a paradigm that shows up a couple of times, and recently a woman that was pursuing me romantically or sexually said to me, she used this expression, "best of both worlds." Well, you
Mm.
have the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
It's so not true. It's so not true. So first of all, so not both worlds. I only inhabit one world, and that's women's world. But separately, the best of both worlds. The best part of masculinity is their strength, and I don't know, like if I'm going to just talk about masculine, their muskiness, their hairy chests, their height, their strength, their bravado. These are things that I love about men. None of those things are extant in me.
Mm.
I think that they're saying penis, and that's not true either because what I have, which I have at sometimes referred to as a sheeness, and I
Mm-hmm.
sometimes referred to as a clit, it's actively shrinking because of estrogen and because of blockers,
Mm-hmm.
and I have no interest in using it in the way that men use it, and that's not the way that I understand it. That's not the way I behave towards it. That's not the way I want the lover to see it,
Mm.
and it's not. It's by all means not the parts about me that I'm proudest of. I love my boobs. I doing squats to try to develop a nicer ass. Those are parts of my physicality that I care about. In terms of best of both worlds, talking about women, the thing that's best about woman, in my opinion, and again, this could be debated at no end, but this is just my own personal view, is the best part of woman is the ability to bring life, the womb as a miraculous mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So the uterus, the fallopian tubes, that's the best part of being a woman. And of course, it's also the curse of being a woman because so much marginalization and so much emotional labor goes tangled into that. But I don't have those. So I know, if anything, I'm mediocre of both worlds. Years ago, I saw an old ad for, I work in marketing, so we see these things every now and then. It was an ad for a floating car that Ford had come up with in the 70s.
Mm.
And I looked it up online, and a critic had said, as a car, not much of a car. As a boat, not much of a boat.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, and I'm being a little self-effacing, but I think that there's a lot of that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
a woman that has a unique physicality. I'm a woman that has some attributes that some people see as a hindrance and some people see as a benefit.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing about me that's the best of both worlds. I do have the best of both worlds in the fact that I have a perspective about gender and a perspective about men and women that can be really
Mm-hmm.
informing to culture as a whole. Two spirit people in indigenous cultures were considered sacred because they had this amazing perspective, and I'm really good at fixing relationships because of it, because I can explain boys to girls and I can explain girls to boys.
Mm-hmm.
But so more to the point, in terms of my own physicality, I you know I have described being trans, that it has felt at times to me as a disability, and in that sense, the fact that I've witnessed three pregnancies and three births, and I've experienced those as a barren woman, and feeling my loss as I feel the wonder that's happening in somebody else. So yeah, to some extent it's a disability, but I would say that there's a progression that's worth mentioning. I
Mm-hmm.
went from originally understanding myself to be a pervert and a sinner, and it's all my fault because I'm twisted and I need to pray. I grew up in a religious environment, Russian Orthodox, which is like Catholics without the sense of humor.
Oh.
But then I went from considering myself a pervert to a much upgraded version of that, to thinking that I'm just defective. And I wasn't even thinking about trans. I was just thinking about me being attracted to men and being attracted to women, and eventually classing myself as bisexual and pansexual.
Mhm.
And took years and years and years to start thinking of that as a valid sexuality. When
Mm.
it came to my gender identity, I went from pervert to freak, from freak to broken, from broken to birth defect to disability. Kind of like the way you think of Parkinson's or diabetes, that I'm just challenged in that sense. And I only recently have come to this new understanding of myself. And I hesitate to think of how many trans women have not made this turn yet. And it's a really important one.
Mhm.
When you research indigenous culture, you find that, and when you research neurobiology, you find that the diversity of gender is massive. And there is not just XY and XX chromosomes. There's XXXY and there's XXX and there's mosaicism and there's all these different manifestations of gender. And when you look at indigenous culture, you find that in Mexico they had the Mujis, and in Hawaii they had the Mahus, and in Indonesia they had a third sex, and in all of the Polynesian islands they had multiple genders. The Hindu religion recognizes 11 genders, and there's a whole swath of Indonesia that recognizes five.
Mm.
And you find out that the binary understanding of gender is a complete invention of European colonialism
Mm.
that they have forcefully and violently shoved down the throats of indigenous cultures. And then you, in my case, I emerged from that understanding myself as just, I'm just another type of human. I'm a less recurring, less common type of human, in the same way that vitiligo is not as common, in the same way that gingers are not that common. There's almost as many transgender people in the world as there are redheaded people.
Mhm.
So because we're less common, less frequent in society, doesn't mean that we're freaks, doesn't mean that we're not normal. And frankly, I emerged out of all of this with a big sense of rage
Mm.
about how victimized I've been all my life over something that is actually not natural, uncommon, infrequent, but natural.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
wow, that was a long answer.
That's all good. Yeah, yeah.
I'm a little bit misandric. I I have been the captive of men culture for many years, and I consider that men are generally understood as a gender in society, but there's a nuance that's like, there's a layer that's not spoken about, which is men is also a cult. Jamila Jamil talks about this in a wonderful talk called "Tell the Voice," which is up on YouTube, and you should all look at it.
I should put it in the
But
notes.
men are indoctrinated. Yes, men are indoctrinated into a cult, which has a lot of toxicity in it and has a tremendously limited view of the world, and that teaches entitlement and teaches oppression. And because of that, I'm not a fan of men as a demographic, as a group. But I am keen on men on an individual basis. I've slept with a number of men, and I consider several men close friends. Generally speaking, they don't appeal to me as a group because so many of them are just awful in their approach towards women. And if you're a good man listening to this, know that I'm not talking about you. Well, there's three possibilities. There's one possibility that I'm not talking about you. There's another possibility that I am talking about you, and you need to take a hard look at yourself. Um, and the third possibility is that I'm talking about you, in which case you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. So that's. But if I'm not talking about you, then don't feel personally aggrieved, but just turn towards the men in your community, in your group, and try to ask them to do better, because far too many men are just far too awful. Because of that, I don't pander to men and I don't mince words. And
Mm.
one of the things I found, which we touched on one of our conversations offline, is that in my work in sex positive spaces, I found that men are, generally speaking, and whenever we speak in generalities, it's a little fraught, but generally speaking, very free, very almost presumptuously free to exercise their sexuality and the sex expression. And they're very tremendously at ease with their physique,
Mm-hmm.
whereas women are just full of shame and fear and self consciousness and terrified about their sexual performance.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just heartbreaking to watch. It's heartbreaking because I use this is an analogy that I'm trying on for size. I don't even know if I'll keep it because it's so frail an analogy. But I'm sailing from one port to another destination, and my voyage is taking me into the land of women. And more the closer I get, the more I realize the land of women sucks. Misogyny sucks, and it's so pervasive in society. And it's like you're escorted into a room, and then you walk into that room, and you're like, oh, this is a small room, and there's no amenities, and like this is all we get. So I would consider myself a champion of women, and
Mm-hmm.
which ties into something else. People ask me, how why did you choose to be a woman, or how did you choose to be a woman?
Mm-hmm.
And that's very poor understanding of my experience, because I've never chosen to be what I am, in the same way that you would probably relate to this if I asked you, how did you choose to be a woman? It's just something that you always were, and that there's no escaping from, and that you might as well take pride in, because that's what you are.
Mm-hmm.
And being that we are women in this world, we're trying to make this world a little better for women, because that's the world we inhabit.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my view of men and women. And also, I speak a lot of this dichotomy of men and women. I dated a non-binary person for a couple of years, and they constantly tried to tell me that the whole dichotomy, the whole war of the sexes, is something that they think is ridiculous, and they think that it's a religion that they don't participate in, and there is no such thing as gender. So it was a really it was fruitful, but it was also a funny conversation, because they would say there is no such thing as gender, and I'm saying I've just gone through a whole world of trouble for gender, so I disagree.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. Well, I also watched your video from the Mystery Box show, which is called A Pineapple is Not a Broken Orange, which is fantastic. And I'll link to it and everyone should watch it. And one of the things that stood out for me was you said sometimes a girl doesn't so much want to have sex as she wants to feel desired. And yeah, you mentioned you work with sex positive, community and things like that. So
Mhm.
from your perspective, I mean, you have a unique perspective on all this, basically. Can you tell us a bit more about the whole sex positive work that you do?
Yeah, and there's a nuance there that at some point I'm going to turn into an article. I just don't have it fleshed out yet, but there's something brewing in there, in the fact that if you why do people have sex, and if they have sex in order to have a sensual experience, that's valid, and that's one way. If they're having sex in order to commune with somebody and to really bond with somebody, then that's another good reason to have sex. A lot of people have sex to please somebody else, women especially. The amount of times that we women have had sex with someone just because we want to please is just staggering. And another reason why we have sex is to validate ourselves, to be validated, to be seen, to be seen as desirable, to be seen as viable sexually.
Mm,
And so the strange unevenness of our gender society is that for a man to be sexually validated, he needs to ask a woman, would you like to come to my pad? And she needs to say, yes, I would. That's
mhm,
the end of it. At that point, he gets the validation he needed.
mhm,
Now, of course, he's now stuck with the fact that he has to proceed and go through the motions because she has said yes. And
mhm,
this is literally what some men experience, that they commit themselves to sex because they just wanted that validation of, like, yes, I would. If they could be late, if they could just say, oh, thank you, I was just checking, they would. um, of course, a lot of men also seek the sensual experience and the orgasm, so they will pursue the rest of the evening. But they want that validation, and they obtain it the moment that we say yes. That's the moment of the obtain it. It doesn't work like that for us. For us, we understand that women are a commodity, and that men commodify sex, and that men would have sex with anyone into legs. And so as a result, we need to be in bed and treated a particular way and be touched a particular way and hear affirmative words and other things for us to feel validated sexually. So it's very, very often that we have sex and then do not feel validated sexually. And this is rampant, unfortunately, and something that needs to be corrected, I think, in society. The sex positive work that I do started because I found my home in a community in Los Angeles, sex positive LA. I was early in my transition and I was very aware of the fact that I looked this ambiguous freak. There's a stage of about 2 years that's really awkward when we first get on hormones or when we are not even on hormones yet, but we're required to present feminine. We are required to present feminine for 2 years before we're allowed on hormones.
Wow.
So yeah, we're not just playing dress up. We're trying to comply with a governmental requirement in order to be able to start their transition. People don't realize this. But anyway, so I found this community that accepted me. It was the first time I heard of pronouns, and I just fell in love with this community. And at the face of it, we were all looking for sex. So it was in some ways perhaps a better version of a swinger community. But I found that over time it was much more than that. And there was a lot of sex education happening, and there was education on consent happening, and there was feminism happening, and boundaries were set in place, and we are talking about safe words, and it was an education. And it allowed me to be an educator because I was able to lead many of these classes after undergoing training in them. And I found that this aligned very much to my mission of trying to free people of shame and give people a better understanding of this topic, which is so crucial to our human experience, and
Hmm.
yet so constantly misunderstood and so constantly shrugged aside in our society and shunted aside, which is our sexual experience. So yeah, so I worked in sex positive spaces at different levels of leadership and facilitated sexual events and classes, and all that came to a grinding halt with the COVID pandemic and lockdown, of course, in early 2020. But that was my experience for a few years, and I had some amazing moments there.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, you've taken some of your classes online, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, we struggled in the group in Portland that I work with, and in a global community that I belong to. We struggled to continue the vibe by taking it online, and there's been some Zoom events and stuff. This New Year's Eve, I led a worldwide global sex party on Zoom with 60 plus people in attendance, and it was pretty fun.
That sounds like a fun night. Yeah.
It was, yeah. But so I decided that it was time for me to launch into my own community. And because it's my own community, I get to designate the way that I would like to structure this. And one of the immediate thoughts that came to me is I don't want men in the group, partly because of the way men behave, which sometimes tends to be taking up the whole room. Sometimes it carries a certain presumptuousness that can be really irritating. But it wasn't really because of the way men behave, it's because of the way women behave when there's men in the room. They change and they start being performative and they adjust towards male gaze. They start being competitive to one another. And when there's no men present, this sacred vibe that I really like of us just talking among ourselves and helping one another out and growing together is present. And so I didn't want to break that bubble. So I knew that I didn't want men in the group. I, of course, allow trans women in the group. That goes without saying, but I'm going to state it anyway. I had this really funny moment in a few years ago, which kind of shows you the limits of my own intellect, I suppose. But I was leading a naughty slumber party, and there were about 25 women in the group. And this time, three trans women had come. And it was the first time that there was more than one trans woman in the group. There was one that was religiously attending my group, but this time she had brought two friends, so there were three trans women in the group. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm saying this with much embarrassment. So if you're listening to the podcast and you decide to write me an angry letter, then by all means I deserve it. And go ahead and send it. But I looked across the room and I saw the three trans women sitting there, and I gave myself a virtual pat in the back, thinking to myself how inclusive I am.
Mm.
And it took me 2 beats to go, "You idiot! You are transgender yourself." So
Ah, yeah.
I
That's
get caught up in these things sometimes. It's really funny. But so of course I made it trans inclusive, but I also made it non-binary inclusive, which is a little bit of a challenge because some non-binary people bring a mask vibe to them, and some of them bring a femme vibe to them. Generally, I've been able to create a really healthy community. There were only one or two instances where I had to have a conversation with someone, and it's interesting because I've had to have a conversation with a cis woman along these lines. I've had to have a conversation with a trans woman along these lines, and I've had to have a conversation with a non-binary person along these lines. So it's emerged across all demographics, but I've had to tell them that for X number of reasons, I don't know that they're a good fit for the group. But
Mhm.
other than that, I have thousands of women in the group, and we've been able to congregate and have these really, really intense conversations.
Mm.
So I'm really happy that I've been able to some extent, to bring the vibe online. And now that we're online, we're global. So I have Ghana and New Zealand and Bulgaria and South Africa and London and Canada and Australia and so many different parts of the world. Pakistan and Bangladesh, which
Wow.
it's I hope that none of these women get in trouble by their browsing history at any point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you were saying just now, or touching on how women communicate amongst each other, and also you found
Hmm.
what was it? I don't.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I noticed the most was the conversation around periods. And this is just one example of many, many, many. But something that's interesting to me is that when we women gather and we talk amongst ourselves, do you have a pad on you? I'm on my second tampon today. Oh my God, I'm flowing so heavily. Or, my period hasn't come in yet. It's so irregular these days. This is natural parts of conversation.
Mhm.
And the moment that one single man enters the room, that conversation dies down
Mm.
completely.
Mhm.
And I find that to be so fatuous because men should know about periods and tampons and
Yeah.
endometriosis and whatever else. They
Yeah.
have girlfriends, they have sisters, they have wives, they have children, they have daughters.
Yeah.
So, anyway, but that's one manifestation of the way the room changes. And there are so many ways in which the room changes
Mhm.
when that bubble of just women is broken. So I really like that bubble, and
Mm.
we open up in ways. But also, I think that what's happened is the fact that boys talk a lot about sex among themselves, and they usually do it in a braggy way, and they usually do it in a jokey way. And many boy cultures have the no homo rule. No homo meaning they're not going to discuss anything that even remotely challenges heterosexuality. But they talk a lot about their sexuality and their sexual experiences with one another, and I'm shocked to find that very few women groups do that. And not even discussions about, like, I had mentioned labia size as a thing. And
Mm.
so being able to facilitate those conversations has been really important to me, to get them to get these conversations to happen. I don't know if this is a apropos time to talk about that labia thing with the sandwiches.
Absolutely. Yeah. Please
All right, so we're sharing a lot of memes in the group. The group is Smart Sluts, and I should be plugging it a lot more than I'm plugging it. I'm doing a lousy job as a promoter. The
do.
group is called Smart Sluts, and it will soon reside on a website called smartsluts.org. If I think everything goes according to plan, there's a Kickstarter that's launching for this, sluts.news/Kickstarter. So in the group, we share a lot of memes, and one of the memes that came up on the feed was there were two sandwiches side by side, and one sandwich, this was an extremely unkind, misogynistic meme
Mhm.
and body shaming meme. So one sandwich on the left had big flaps of ham sticking out of the sandwich, and the other sandwich was primly and properly tucked in with the ham inside of the bread.
Mhm.
And the legend or the caption on this was something along the line. It was written by a Christian mother, and something along the line of, "This is why I teach my daughters Christianity. On the left, you have Taylor Swift's vagina. On the right, you have my daughter's vagina." And there are so many things wrong with this meme. So many things just glaringly and just ghastly wrong with this meme. Starting with, how do you know what your daughter's vagina looks like? And following with, those are not vaginas, those are vulvas. Well, they're sandwiches, but they're representing vulvas, not vaginas. And they don't become looser or tighter, and they don't become, the labia don't grow or diminish by virtue of how much sexual experience you've had or how varied a sexual experience you've had. And
Mm.
then, of course, none of the amount of sexual experience a woman has had is not any kind of comment on her worth, for the better or for the worse. And how come we don't talk about penises shrinking because they have been inside of too many vaginas? Yet we speak about vaginas getting looser. It's just, the whole thing is ludicrous. And but what I found is that in my women's group, instead of a reaction of, well, of course that is ludicrous, which is the proper response to that, instead of that, there were many comments of like, I'm so self-conscious about my labia, I'm so self-conscious about the shape of my pussy.
Mm.
And it's horrifying to see, and it's heartbreaking to see. So I re-captioned this meme in Photoshop, and I wrote, "These are sandwiches. These are both delicious sandwiches. The one on the left is a sandwich, and the one on the right is a sandwich, and they're both perfectly normal sandwiches, and you should eat them because they are delicious." And so that was really well received. And that actually evolved because about a week later, and I swear to God, this happened by, I swear to God, I'm an atheist, but whatever, you get the point. Uh, I had gone grocery shopping and I had bought cold cuts and I was making myself a sandwich, completely unrelated to this whole meme. But I found myself holding a ham sandwich.
Mm.
So I used this moment to recreate the large labia, visible labia type of sandwich that they had mocked in the meme. And then I took several pictures of me just kissing and licking and eating that.
Ah, you legend. I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Body shame is something we're constantly fighting with.
Mm. Yeah.
Why don't our mothers tell us this? Why don't our mothers tell us our vulva's normal? I made damn sure to tell my 14-year-old about this. The self-confidence of girls between the age of 12 plummets between the ages of 12 and 14 with the advent of their boobs and with the advent of menstruation. The self-confidence of young girls plummets. And I'm not saying that you need to have as candid a conversation with your 14-year-old daughter as I have with mine, but just essential topics about. I ran a thread on my group about what was your first period experience like. And again, just horrible, horrible situations of a girl that was wearing white pants or a girl that was at a friend's house. Several girls said that they just wadded up toilet paper and used that. And
Mm.
just lack of preparation and the reaction of the parents. One mother just completely ignored the daughter mentioning that she had a period. Another mother was in the middle of a dinner party, and so she went to her daughter in the bathroom
Mm.
and then came out and announced to all the ladies at the dinner party that her daughter had had her first menstruation.
Dear.
Just stupefying in terms of,
Yeah.
yeah. So I generally like to expose and challenge all of these
Mm.
limitations that we women have in terms of our body experience.
Yeah. So, what's the legacy you want to leave behind?
Oh yeah, we spoke about legacy at one point. I came to this concept kind of sidewise. I wasn't thinking of it in those words, and it's now become congealed in those words in my head, and I'm feeling really passionate about it. I've always felt that I want to leave something behind. I've always felt that I want my life to mean something beyond, just getting up to the breakfast and to the job for 9 hours and then to the TV for some solace and whatnot. I want a meaningful life, and this has materialized in a number of ways. But I feel like the Smart Sluts effort is the merging of so many of my life experiences of social justice work and of my experience of womanhood and my migration towards womanhood, if I would use those terms. And I've described this project as my love letter for the women of the world. I want to leave something behind. I want this to impact and influence the lives of thousands of women across the world. And the same way that I came to my sex positive community in 2014, 15, and it changed my life. It's the first time that I had heard of pronouns. It's the first time that I had heard of polyamory. It opened my eyes to many, many vistas. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to partake of all of the things that I run into. There are aspects of kink that I've been exposed to, and I am like, oh, none for me. Thank you very much. But that in and of itself is a learning about yourself. So that's what I want to leave behind: empowered women who are educated. Have I don't know if I've shared this story. My memory is really bad, but I wanted to say the experience I had about the internal clitoris talking to my hairstylist. Did I mention that yet?
Not yet, no. Do tell.
So it's something that really affirmed me the fact that I'm on the right track. I recently dyed my hair rainbow colors. And so I worked with a hairstylist and I went to her salon, and it was a 3 hour experience. So we had plenty of time to chat. We spoke about many things, and I told her about Smart Sluts and about this effort that I'm leading. And as a ways of example of something that women don't know about their sexuality and they should know about their sexuality, I said, well, of course, about the internal clitoris. Many women don't know about their internal clitoris, and she had no idea what I was referring to. And so I described to her that what most people call the clit is actually glance of the clitoris, and the clitoris extends 4 inches inward and wraps around the vagina and has these bulbs that are erectile tissue and in many ways complement or match the erectile tissue of the penis. And she had zero knowledge of this. And I'm talking about a lesbian, a woman loving woman who has been married to another woman for 14 years. And that's just appalling that she didn't know this. It's just such a failing of our sex ed and stuff. Sex ed is always taught strictly from a reproductive way, which is very negative and very toxic. You would think my parents had 3 children. You would think that they've had sex 3 times in their lifetime. Um, so that experience with this woman really pointed to me that there's so much that needs to be discussed. There's so much that needs to be learned. Consent is a huge thing that I want to make sure that gets into this podcast. We are so used to appeasing, so often we have sex without our consent, and so often our consent is violated and we are not even giving it a second thought.
Hmm.
um, I was in a sexual situation a few years ago in 2010, and I was in bed with this man. Well, I was in the hot tub with this man, and he decided to call a friend for us to experience a threesome, which I was reluctantly willing to do. We just wanted to connect with him. Threesomes have their virtue, but I just wasn't particularly eager that night for it. He called a
Hmm.
friend who was a stranger to me and who didn't win me over, and I quickly decided that I was going to continue having sex with Larry, with the man I was with, but I had no interest in interacting with this other man, and that he was open to do whatever he wanted to Larry, the same way that I would be open to do anything I wanted to Larry. But there had been no conversation between us, between
Hmm.
this man and I, and there was no interest on my part to pursue anything. And then at one point, just because I hadn't really thought about the way I'm positioning my body, I was giving my man oral sex, and my ass was up in the air. So this complete stranger took it upon himself to penetrate me to the hilt without a condom and without lubrication,
Whoa.
and which is basically rape. Both of the men dismissed it as being difficult, and I left, and it was last time that I saw either of them. That happened years before I learned about sex positive culture. Had I been active in sex positive communities, I would have had a much better understanding of
Hmm.
myself, of the situation, and I would have comported myself very differently. And when I shared those moments, So many women tell me they've had similar situations. So many women tell me about being sexually invaded or coerced or talked into or not listened to when they say no.
Mhm.
It's frankly appalling. So injecting this culture with consent is drastic. And if I go completely sideways on this conversation for just a brief moment to talk about politics,
Mhm.
the man who's currently occupying the White House in the United States
At the time of recording, this was Trump.
is the embodiment of everything that defies consent culture. It is a culture of invasion and conquest and coercion and force and colonization that he has brought to the culture. And hopefully people are denouncing it now. But that is essentially what's wrong. What there's so many things that I object to that man politically, but at the core, it is the fact that it's that the salesperson, the toxic aspect of sales. There are good aspects of sales, but the toxic part of a salesperson of disrespecting boundaries and crossing lines and coercing and persuading and forcing, and now it's just running amok in our society, and that's what we need to defy. We need to talk about agency and consent and collaboration in terms of sex instead of in terms of women being taken by
Mhm.
men.
Totally. Yeah. Sovereignty all the way. Yeah.
Sovereignty, that's a great word. Yes.
Yeah.
What a great idea for women to be in charge of their own bodies, right?
Isn't it crazy? Yeah. Wow. Well, is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
We could keep talking for hours,
I
but
know, right?
I know that we have a limited time. The most important thing that I have to say is my effort is about to be born to the world with this Kickstarter, sluts.news/Kickstarter. You're going to find the Kickstarter for this project, and I really need everybody's support. So I'm really hoping that this is going to bring it to new audiences. And if you find the Kickstarter for Smart Sluts, please support it and then share it. Share it in your groups, share it to your communities. If you have a newsletter, if you have any kind of visibility and you have an audience, share it with them because we need this in the world and we need as many women to be cognizant of it as possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amen to that in an atheist kind of way.
Well said.
Oh, thank you so much for talking to me, Cass.
Esther, thanks so much for having me.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Cassie, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Cassie on her website, CassieBrighter.com, as well as on empoweredtranswoman.com and smartsluts.org. You can support her Kickstarter campaign on sluts.news/Kickstarter. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com and on social media. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Plans start from only $1 a month. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender for more details. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open minded. If you say something for me for a moment, I can see if the sound is registering.
The quick brown fox ran over the lazy dog.
Oh, excellent. Yes. Yes, it did.
I'm sorry, my voice is really raspy this morning. I'm going to drink something. Tequila. No, just kidding. Mhm.
Whatever floats your boat, right?